Have you ever looked at an old map and noticed something strange at the edges? Not rivers, not towns, not roads, but dragons, sea serpents, giants, and warning phrases like, "Here be monsters." For ancient people, the world was not a finished picture. It was a half-known place, and beyond the familiar borders lay danger, mystery, and imagination. When explorers, traders, and travelers reached the edge of what people knew, they often came back with stories, and when the stories were incomplete, frightened, or impossible to verify, the unknown got filled in with monsters. Today, we think of monsters as fantasy, but in the ancient world, they were often a serious way of explaining what could not yet be explained. They marked the limits of human knowledge. They warned people away from dangerous places. They turned fear into story and story into meaning. So, where did these monsters come from? Why did so many ancient cultures imagine strange beings at the edges of the map? And what can these creatures tell us about how humans have always tried to understand the unknown? Let's find out. To understand why monsters appeared in ancient stories, we first have to understand how people saw the world. For most of human history, the known world was small. If you lived in a valley, the mountains beyond it might as well have been another planet. If you were a sailor, the sea beyond the horizon was not a place of adventure first. It was a place of uncertainty. If you were a merchant traveling between cities, each unfamiliar border crossing carried risk: bandits, disease, starvation, storms, hostile rulers, and unfamiliar customs. The world was not divided neatly into safe and unsafe, the way we might imagine it today. It was more like a circle of familiarity surrounded by an enormous dark ring of possibility. And in that dark ring, stories began to grow. One of the oldest functions of monsters was simple. They explained danger. If a coastal region had dangerous currents or hidden reefs, people might say a sea monster lived there. If a mountain pass was deadly and difficult to cross, legends might describe giants or demons guarding it. If a desert swallowed travelers, it was easy to imagine a creature lurking in the sand, waiting to devour the careless. This was not always superstition in the crude sense. It was a way of encoding practical knowledge in memorable form. A story about a monster could carry a warning more effectively than a dry instruction. "Don't sail there because the waters are treacherous" may be true, but "a serpent lives there and drags ships into the deep" stays in the mind. Ancient societies depended on oral tradition, and oral tradition loves vivid images. That's why so many cultures created boundary monsters. They often appeared near the edge of a kingdom, the edge of a forest, the edge of the sea, or the edge of the known world. In ancient Greek myth, for example, the world was full of creatures that represented the dangers of unexplored space. At the far western edges of the world, beyond the familiar lands of Greece, there were tales of strange peoples and monstrous beings. The Greeks imagined places like the land of the Hyperboreans, a distant northern paradise, and also regions where danger and distortion became nearly impossible to separate. The farther you went from home, the less human the world seemed. That idea shows up again and again in myth. In many traditions, the center is civilized, ordered, and known, while the edges are wild, chaotic, and inhabited by beings that are part human, part animal, or wholly other. This is not an accident. It reflects a deep human pattern. We define ourselves by contrast. The known world becomes meaningful because there is something beyond it. Ancient maps are especially revealing here. They were not just tools for navigation. They were also stories about the world. Some maps combined real geography with imagination, and the line between the two could be blurry. If a mapmaker had heard rumors of a distant land but had never seen it, that land might be drawn with symbolic creatures, strange labels, or warnings. In medieval Europe, maps sometimes placed monstrous races at the outer edges of the earth. People with dog heads, people with no heads and faces in their chests, people with one giant foot, and so on. These creatures were not always meant literally. They often represented the idea of distant places being radically different from home. But this habit is much older than medieval Europe. Long before that, ancient Mesopotamian, Egyptian, Greek, Indian, Chinese, and other traditions all developed beings that lived in the spaces between what was known and what was feared. Take Mesopotamia, one of the earliest centers of civilization. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, perhaps the world's oldest great literary work, the hero journeys into dangerous and unfamiliar territories. There he faces beings like Humbaba, the guardian of the cedar forest. Humbaba is not just a random monster. He stands at the boundary between civilization and wilderness. The forest he protects is a place humans do not easily control. To go there is to leave the safe, ordered world behind. Humbaba becomes the face of that risk. Even the sea itself often took on monstrous form. In many ancient cultures, the ocean was not a romantic place of freedom. It was an abyss of uncertainty. The Hebrew Bible contains the image of Leviathan, a giant sea creature associated with chaos and overwhelming power. In other ancient Near Eastern traditions, sea monsters symbolized the forces of disorder that threatened creation itself. The sea was unpredictable, immense, and deadly. So the idea that it contained a monster was not irrational. It was a narrative expression of real fear. Ancient Egypt had its own powerful relationship with monsters and the unknown. The Nile was the center of life, but beyond its narrow green corridor lay deserts full of danger. Foreign lands, especially those to the south or east, could be imagined as realms of strange beings and hostile forces. Egyptian mythology often framed the world as a struggle between order and chaos, with monstrous powers threatening to break through the boundaries of civilization. In this worldview, monsters were not just creatures in the dark. They were symbols of what happens when order fails. This is one reason monsters endure across cultures. They are never only about teeth and claws. They are about uncertainty. They are about the fear that the world is larger, stranger, and less controllable than we want it to be. But there's another reason ancient stories filled the unknown with monsters. Human beings are pattern-making animals. When we encounter something unfamiliar, our minds try to make it fit into existing categories. If a traveler heard a second-hand description of a rhinoceros, an elephant, or a crocodile without ever seeing one, the resulting story might become a hybrid creature in retelling. This happened constantly in the ancient world, where information traveled slowly and often changed shape along the way. A famous example is the idea of the monstrous races found in ancient and medieval texts. Some of these were inspired by misunderstood reports of real people or real animals from distant lands. Others were the product of imagination layered on top of rumor. A simple observation could become exaggerated over generations until it transformed into a creature. A hairy tribe might become dog-headed people. A remote island population might become a society of one-legged beings. A real animal glimpsed from afar might be described in impossible terms. This process tells us something important. Ancient monsters were often born at the intersection of ignorance and storytelling. They were not always lies. They were attempts to describe the world with the information available at the time. And sometimes, monsters had a political purpose. If you are a ruler, a kingdom is easier to defend when the outside world seems frightening. If the borderlands are full of dragons, demons, or savage beings, then staying inside the kingdom feels safer and more civilized. Ancient empires often used stories of monstrous outsiders to reinforce the idea that their own culture was the center of order. The unknown became a contrast that made the familiar feel superior. This is especially clear in stories that divide the world into us and them. The farther away a people lived, the more likely they were to be described in exaggerated or fantastical terms. It is a pattern that appears in many civilizations. The edge of the map is not just a place of monsters. It is a place where identity gets projected outward. The monster becomes a mirror. It reflects what the culture fears, rejects, or does not understand about itself. That idea is one of the most fascinating things about ancient monster stories. They reveal the psychology of the people who told them. A monster is never just a creature. It is a social and emotional symbol. It can represent foreignness, disease, death, chaos, moral failure, sexual anxiety, natural disaster, or the fear of the wilderness. Different cultures used monsters differently, but the core function was often the same. They gave shape to the formless. Think about dragons, for instance. Dragons appear in so many cultures that it would be a mistake to treat them as one single idea. In ancient China, dragons were often powerful, auspicious, and tied to water, rainfall, and imperial authority. In many European traditions, dragons were dangerous adversaries to be slain. In both cases, though, the dragon stands at a threshold. It is a being of immense power connected to forces humans cannot fully control. It lives in mountains, caves, rivers, storms, or distant lands. It belongs at the edge because it represents a kind of power beyond ordinary life. Sea serpents work the same way. The sea is already vast, hidden, and difficult to master. Put a serpent in it, and the unknown becomes personal. Now the ocean is not just dangerous. It is alive, watching, and hungry. Some of the most famous ancient exploration stories are practically monster catalogs. When Greek writers described distant lands, they often mixed real geography with fantastic beings. Herodotus, sometimes called the father of history, also collected and repeated a great many unusual accounts of faraway peoples and creatures. He was not writing modern history. He was trying to assemble a picture of the world from travelers' tales, local reports, and his own interpretations. In that kind of world, the line between history and legend was porous. That porous line is exactly where monsters thrive. The same pattern appears in the far north. For Mediterranean peoples, lands beyond the familiar world could seem cold, remote, and alien. Northern regions were often imagined as homes of strange tribes, supernatural creatures, or endless darkness. In many cultures, the North symbolized mystery and danger. The exact creatures changed, but the logic remained constant. Distance from the center invited imagination. The edge of the map also mattered, because maps themselves are statements of power. To map a place is to claim knowledge of it. But when knowledge runs out, imagination rushes in. A monster at the border says, in effect, "Here the mapmaker no longer knows." It is both a confession and a warning. And yet, monsters were not always purely negative. Sometimes they were guardians. Sometimes they marked sacred territory. Sometimes they protected treasures, holy sites, or forbidden knowledge. In myth, a monster is often the test that separates the ordinary from the extraordinary. If you can face the creature at the edge, you can enter the next stage of the journey. That is why so many heroes in ancient stories must confront dragons, giants, or other beings before they can return transformed. This is a crucial point. Ancient monsters were not only about fear, they were also about transition. They lived at thresholds, because thresholds are where change happens. The edge of the map is where the known world ends, but it is also where discovery begins. Monsters stand there because they are the price of crossing from ignorance into understanding. Over time, many of the creatures that were once treated as real gradually became symbolic, then literary, then purely fictional. As geography improved, as travel increased, and as scientific methods developed, the literal need for monsters at the edges of maps faded. But the deeper human impulse never disappeared. We still do this today. We may not draw dragons on our maps, but we still imagine monsters in the unknown. We attach fears to deep space, the deep ocean, artificial intelligence, viruses, remote regions, and future technologies we don't fully understand. The monster has not vanished. It has simply changed costume. That's because the unknown still unsettles us. And when humans feel unsettled, we tell stories. Stories give shape to uncertainty. They make danger visible. They help communities share warnings, values, and identity. Ancient monsters were one of the earliest and most powerful tools for doing exactly that. So, when you see a monster at the edge of an old map, don't just think of it as a mistake or a primitive superstition. Think of it as a message. It says, this is where knowledge ends. It says, beyond here, we are guessing. It says, what lies outside the familiar is powerful, dangerous, and not yet understood. And maybe that is why these stories still fascinate us. Deep down, we know the feeling. Every age has its edges. Every civilization has its blind spots. Every human being has a frontier beyond which certainty breaks down. Ancient people drew monsters there because they had to name the fear somehow. In the end, monsters at the edge of the map were not just about what was out there. They were about us, about our need to explain, to warn, to imagine, and to survive in a world that is always larger than our understanding. So the next time you hear an old myth about a sea serpent, a giant, a dragon, or a strange people living beyond the horizon, ask yourself what it might have meant to the person who told it. What danger were they trying to describe? What mystery were they trying to contain? What part of the world had not yet been mapped? Because in ancient stories, monsters were never only monsters. They were the shape of the unknown. If you enjoyed this journey into myth, history, and the strange edges of ancient imagination. Subscribe for more stories like this. And let me know in the comments, what ancient monster do you find the most fascinating, and why?